No pun intended, but regenerating the orchards of America can be kind of a tough nut to crack. And today on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to be joined by Understanding Ag consultant Chuck Schembre to talk about how he sees that process playing out.
When we implement regenerative practices, which really comes down to enhancing the orchard floor photosynthesis, grow more biomass on the orchard floor, grow biomass to promote diversity as abundantly, as aggressively as you can within your context. The only way that we build an abundance of fungi is to build an abundance of biomass or organic matter, living organic matter on the orchard floor.
We're also going to talk to him about his favorite role for livestock within an orchard system.
The thing that I believe is probably one of the most powerful pieces of livestock for orchards that gets me the most excited is their role in managing pest and disease. Chickens, especially layers, someone recently called them velociraptors. And I was like, you know what? That's pretty darn accurate. I mean, they are scratching and clawing and they are going after, larvae. They're eating all types of insects, and they're going to help build that biology that's going to break down and suppress some of these disease pathogens.
And much more on this episode 410 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined by Chuck Schembre. Chuck is a regenerative specialty crop consultant for Understanding Ag, and he focuses on vineyards, orchards, diversified vegetable cropping systems, and he's got experience working with all kinds of things, small grains, hay crops, and pastures. Chuck has done lots of videos about compost and some of those things. But today we're going to focus on the orchard side of things and how do we regenerate this critical piece of our food system. We're going to talk to him about how he's seen it done and some of the things that he's really paying attention to in that regard. And we'll get to that conversation with Chuck Schembre right after this word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything but the knowledge to grow healthier soil, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still hoping next year's going to be better, maybe it's time to give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Chuck, thanks for joining me again on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Hey, Clay. Pleasure to be here as always. Thank you.
Always good to get a little outside of my comfort zone and talk to somebody who's doing things outside of what I'm familiar with. And actually, that's a fairly broad group of things that are outside of what I'm familiar with. But where we're going to spend our time talking today is about orchards and kind of those kind of things. So just give us a sense of kind of what kind of crops are grown in orchards. What are some of the things that we might encounter in a grocery store that are in an orchard?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it might be a little bit more broad than people think. I mean, it's basically every type of common fruit besides a strawberry. You could say blueberries are grown in an orchard setting. Anything that's planted in a linear line, that's a perennial crop that usually creates some kind of woody biomass at the trunk. We could fit raspberries and vineyards. Vineyards are an orchard setting. So I basically group any kind of tree crop, whether it be fruit, nut, and and brambles, berries, type of crops to grapevines. That would be in the orchard category for today's discussion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and obviously we're talking Soil Health Academy, Understanding Ag today. We got to set the context. So what is kind of the context of management of those crops right now, conventionally speaking, as it stands?
Yeah, and interestingly, there's a lot of similar approaches across many of these orchard crops, and it depends if you're in the West Coast region or East. But essentially, the goal is to keep as much vegetation orchard as possible, especially around the tree or the vine. I'll just talk about trees to keep it simple, but keeping the tree row or the tree berm free of weeds and very, very free of weeds, bare soil, and we see a tremendous amount of compacted. Most of the dysfunctional soil we see is really in that tree row. And then in between the tree row, we call that the alleyways or the cover middles. The alleyways are generally managed to be very short vegetation, or out west, there's a lot of tillage. Out west, often there's always been a culture of having no vegetation in the orchards and keeping it clean tilled, and then with that herbicide strip. And then, a lot of fruit crops are heavily sprayed with fungicides, pesticides, insecticides, miticides. There's plant growth regulators that are used to slow down the crop. And, you have your standard, I call them bare bone fertilizers, like we'll find in any cropping system, even, the same fertilizers used in the annual crops. But I mean, that sound pretty grim. And, there's a lot of really knowledgeable horticulturalists that I don't ever want to demean when I just start talking about all the chemicals going in. They've really figured out precise timing of certain nutrients. And there's a lot of things that we have to glean from the conventional orchard world. But just to summarize it, there's a tremendous amount of inputs going in and a tremendous amount of tractor work. And, the labor is, it's very intense at this point.
Aside from all of the unintended consequences of those inputs, the kind of literal bottom line of that is a lot of capital investment in, like you said, infrastructure, equipment to apply it, money to purchase the inputs, time, labor to put it on. So whether or not we're talking about the concerns about the unintended consequences of these inputs, the inputs themselves are costing money. So there's an opportunity to increase profitability before we ever get to whether or not the inputs themselves have unintended consequences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we start looking at the regenerative work, there's just so much tremendous opportunity to cut costs, and we can get into that today. But we're seeing a lot of orchards dropping out. We're seeing industries decline. You hear it all over the place, from Washington apples to obviously the Florida citrus and many other crops across California. That the cost to farm is exceeding the revenues.
Yeah. And I think I heard somewhere, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that a fungally dominated soil will tend more towards producing like trees and brushy plant species, and then a bacterially dominated soil will tend towards producing other kinds of plants. Is that correct? Do I have that right? Do you remember?
Yeah, it's a good, simple summary there. And soil fungi are so critical for perennial crops. We probably haven't given enough respect to the association or the evolution, you could say, of perennial crops, trees, any perennial crop. And that actually includes perennial grasses. I mean, if we wanted to look at, perennial bunch grasses in the prairie lands, they had a high fungal, soil fungal component, and trees even more so. So yeah, they're very critical to build.
Yeah, and I think I've heard somebody say a long time ago, actually, kind of way back when I was a kid, my brother told me one time something he'd learned in school was that probably one of the largest living organisms, if not the largest living organism on the planet, is an aspen forest because they're mycorrhizal fungi. That's how they spread. And so they're technically one entity, and so that's another example of that role of fungi in perennial crops and trees, and that's kind of what we're talking about, like you said, from the orchard perspective. So can you talk a little bit more about what are we shooting for, and kind of how is the regenerative management going to continue to help that progress without the inputs?
Yeah, so if folks aren't familiar with fungi on the call, or there's two types that we really break down, and that's the mycorrhizal fungi, and there's multiple types of mycorrhizal fungi. We'll just keep it simple, and they have an association with the tree root system. They're primarily, they live in the soil, and they're an extension of the root system. And the other fungi is saprophytic fungi, or we can just call them the decomposers. They're the ones that live more on the soil surface in the litter. They're breaking down, turning things over. They're the primary decomposers and probably the first stage of real nutrient cycling on not just the orchard floor, but also in, annual crops. When we talk about breaking residues down in a cornfield, we want more saprophytic fungi. But most conventional farms, and I've looked at a lot of soil data, we look at phospholipid fatty acid. It gives us a nice broad overview of the soil fungi. And whether you look under a scope or how you want to approach it, the conventional farms have often very little to, you might as well say, no soil fungi. When we implement regenerative practices, which really comes down to enhancing the orchard floor photosynthesis. So what does that mean? Grow more biomass on the orchard floor and grow biomass to promote diversity, and do that as abundantly, and I should just say as aggressively as you can within your context, making sure you don't devigor your trees and the age of your trees. There's a lot of things we can get into today, how we determine this management, but the only way that we build an abundance of fungi is to build an abundance of biomass or organic matter, living organic matter on the orchard floor. So it's almost like managing a perennial pasture system for, large portions of the year on the orchard floor, to pump that carbon into the soil as much as you can and build those mycorrhizal fungi associations.
Right. And I think, can you talk to me a little bit about some of the conventional wisdom in the orchard world? Because I think that, I'm guessing, the conventional wisdom would say, hey, anything that's growing around that base of that tree is going to rob moisture from the tree and reduce productivity. Is that part of kind of the game they're playing?
Yeah, it's really been reduced down to a simple notion that vegetation, they call it, conventional, we just call it weeds. Gabe Brown and our crew have, they've trained us not to use the word weed, so it's hard for me to get it out of my mouth. But yes, the weeds
get your mouth washed out with soap at Understanding Ag if you use the word weed.
Yeah, they put you on leave for a week, probation. So yeah, the weeds are going to compete against nutrients from water, period. But the other thing is, people have even created an idea that more vegetation equals more insect potential damage and pressure, and even more humidity and fungal pathogens, where it's actually quite the opposite. So there's really no proof that, yes, if you bring more vegetation in the orchard, you will bring way more insects, but that's a good thing. So that we have to educate people on why that's a good thing. Yeah.
Right, because you're bringing in the predator species as well. Is that right? That you're bringing in the species that are eating the negative insect species. Is that how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, more vegetation biomass brings in lots of insects that are beneficial, that are going to predate on the other insects. The other important thing is when you grow vegetation in the orchard to mimic a grassland, at some point in the year, you're bringing in bird species. A lot of grassland type bird species come into the orchard. So what do? Well, they like to eat on larvae that maybe become something like a codling moth or a navel orange worm in almonds and pistachio. So, they're going to eat moths. And so, there's just this, we always say, build it and they will come, the biodiversity will come. So
it is similar to managing grasslands, really, because when we stop trying to manage all the negative things that we can see, we welcome in those bird species, and they are a predator to the flies that become a nuisance to the cattle and some of those things. So, I mean, it's very similar.
Yeah, very similar.
And can you talk a little bit more about how we go about managing for tremendous vegetation biomass on the orchard floor?
Yeah, and it's going to vary based on your climate. There is quite a distinction between the West Coast and the East Coast, and maybe we can get into the two different contexts. But essentially, your bread and butter for maximizing vegetation in a lot of climates is going to be fall into late spring or early summer. And some winters allow for a lot of cool season grasses and cool season species to grow, through the winter. They'll be slow, but then they'll start picking up in February and early March. And then you start getting that explosion of growth. And at that time, the trees are dormant in most climates. It depends. I mean, in California, you're going to have plums and stone fruit and almonds are going to start blooming soon, by the end of the month. So, and then, we have areas where bud break doesn't occur until April, even early May, for some regions depending on the species. So, but, once the plant breaks dormancy, you have a lot of time, because usually to allow these grasses and call them forage species, cover crops to grow, because there's no competition with moisture. Again, depends on your climate. Are we growing in a very arid climate in eastern Washington, or are we over in, Michigan? So, but generally there's enough soil moisture to support the growth of the tree and the growth of the vegetation. And, you do have to start managing the vegetation around the tree in the tree berm earlier. But the goal is to keep that management narrow, meaning we don't need to, wipe out half of the orchard with herbicide sprays. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So we're just finding opportunities to promote as much vegetation. And the other thing is to prolong or hold off on the first mowing, if that's what most orchardists are using for terminating. Mowing will happen really early, sometimes in the season, before that true photosynthetic potential hits, some sort of peak. We have to be thinking about that. Like, when is a plant optimally pumping carbon into the soil? And that's how we build organic matter. That's how we build nutrient cycling. That's how we build deep aggregation and the mycorrhizal fungi populations that will begin connecting to the tree. We have to wait and be patient and understand how ecosystems function in the orchard. And so really what I'm doing with people is, like, I don't want to tell someone, hey, you are going to mow on April 15th, because every year is going to be different. So let's look at it. Let's see what's happening. What's our soil moisture? How does the tree vigor look? And I'll tell you what, I mean, there isn't a single orchard where every single orchard has an opportunity to wait. I say hit that uncomfortable threshold when you're first working with a grower or someone who's new to it. More vegetation is going to scare them, but if you follow some of these ideas I'm talking about, where we can push that vegetation further into spring, early summer, and then just for the East Coast where there's rain all through the summer. There's a lot more potential there to, really manage for a beautiful perennial grassland system. And I've bumped into apple orchards that are 50 to 80 years old, and they don't even really manage the vegetation because the tree root system's so deep. The trees are just proliferating. So, when you get an opportunity like I have to see sometimes an abandoned orchard or an old homestead orchard or just an old commercial orchard that they don't want to put a lot of energy in, you actually see what's possible.
And talk a little bit about that diversity piece as well. I mean, you mentioned cover crops, but I mean, obviously the diversity comes as we are managing regeneratively. That diversity is going to be one of the pieces that will eventually come as well. So what are some of those strategies as far as diversity is concerned?
Yeah, good point. I didn't bring up seeding cover crops. I mean, that is something that might be your first step if your soils are, fairly degraded, or, and you don't have a lot of diversity out there. And, cover crops can be great to really get the system moving. And in a lot of especially out west, where our rains come, kind of like clockwork, it's sometime in fall, and cool seasons grow really well out in most Western climates. So, and the thing is, you don't always have to seed a cover crop. And that's really important, because if you have a good latent seed bank or resident vegetation that just comes up, I mean, we're trying to hit the principles of soil health as best we can by maximizing soil armor, maximizing the living root. I like to think about it, just maximize photosynthesis. So, the first step is just reducing the disturbances, allowing the vegetation to grow. And if you're seeding a cover crop, if you're going to get your maximum investment out of it, you've really got to embrace allowing that cover to reach a high, tall biomass, because that's going to put more armor down on the soil. That's going to cycle more nutrients for you. So either way you look at it, yeah, you need to take an approach where you're allowing that vegetation to grow quite tall.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles has only grown, and there are two primary reasons for that growth. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who have been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions, and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. What are we doing as far as the base of the tree is concerned? What are some of the considerations there? What are you paying attention to and keeping an eye on?
Yeah. So, and sorry, Clay, you asked me about diversity in the other question. And what I meant to conclude with is that when you allow the biomass to get tall, you're going to promote more diversity.
Right.
You're going to let things go to seed, and you give things a chance, things that are slower, that are in the understory. And just like when you hear everyone talking about managing for pastures through adaptive grazing, exact same philosophy on increasing diversity. So managing for the tree row, basically, as we get as the tree or the vine begins to break dormancy and it starts putting on a canopy, that's when it's going to start wanting to utilize more water. Photosynthesis is happening, and that's really around the time you want to be getting at your weed management. And in the conventional world, what's been happening is as soon as the tree goes dormant, and same thing in vineyards, they'll come in and spray, and that might be December, just because it's a task. It's something to get at. Let's give the crew something to do and just get ahead of the weeds. Like, it's kind of that simple, so you have this bare ground going all the way through the winter, and usually just bare ground or in the berm, basically 365 days a year. Now we change the mindset and say, okay, we're going to let things grow because we need to get a living root. Roots fix soil. roots fix biology. So let's get that around the tree. And then depending on the soil condition. So this is where I come in, I guess, for a client. And I want to say farmers should be able to empower themselves to make this decision too. But, if you're looking at Haney test, you're looking at PLFA, you put the shovel to the ground. If you've got really dysfunctional compacted soil with low biology, and probably that means fairly low fertility in the Haney test, you want to be a little bit more cautious with how much vegetation you let grow around the tree. Let's maybe get at it a little bit earlier. Let's not let it get above 6 to 8 inches. Once you allow vegetation to get above 6 to 8 inches, it's harder to terminate it with like a contact herbicide that is not going to be as impactful as, say, glyphosate or systemic or the pre-emergence or something that have to go out before things are even growing. So, and you can use an organic herbicide when the vegetation's a little bit shorter. If you've got in-row, the other thing is depends on the age of the tree or the plant. So the younger it is, the earlier we got to get at the weeds. We need to ensure that we don't devigor anything. We also need to ensure we don't invite a lot of vole and field mice habitat that will girdle the tree when they're young. So once things are well established, if you've got a 5-6-year-old tree, depending on the tree species, some grow slower than others, then you can start letting that vegetation grow bigger and taller. And if you have the acreage to invest and it makes sense to get in-row mowing equipment, now you really can stretch, or push those boundaries on how much vegetation can you allow grow around the tree. But rule of thumb is get at it early when you've got young trees, and get at it early when the soils are really dysfunctional. And when you see those soils building their aggregate, then you can start getting more comfortable with allowing more vegetation to grow. And then obviously there's livestock we can get into when they come in and help you out.
Yeah. Let's talk about livestock integration. I mean, it's one of the 6 principles of soil health. Kind of how, why, what to consider.
There's a lot of things that have been said from understanding ag consultants, and we all believe livestock are a powerful biological primer to the land, and they're very powerful in systems that never have livestock out there. In particular, you'll see a tremendous improvements that are occurring, not just in the soil health, but the whole ecosystem. So I generally tell people, do not consider livestock to be a powerful tool for managing weeds. And the reason that is, and we'll start there because we're talking about weeds, is because in order for livestock to quote unquote take care of these weeds the way you want them to, they're going to have to graze all the way down to the ground. So they're going to help you, they're going to help with some vegetation management around the tree, but the goal is not to use, we're not going to bring sheep in there and have them graze everything down to nothing. Whereas if you are going to spray or you are running a mower through there, you're going to usually do it as tight as you can. So the powerful thing about livestock, as we all know, is they're amazing nutrient cyclers. We're growing this biomass. They come in, they're eating it, and they're cycling these nutrients in different forms. And obviously we have a opportunity for stacking enterprises, whether it's contract grazing or you've got your own herd or flock of birds. The thing that I believe is probably one of the most powerful pieces of livestock for orchards that gets me the most excited is their role in managing pest and disease. Because, and I'll run you through some scenarios here. Chickens, especially layers, are these someone recently, I forgot who was on a podcast, called them velociraptors. And I was like, you know what? That's pretty darn accurate. I mean, they are scratching and clawing, and they are going after, larvae. They're eating all types of insects, and a lot of that larvae they're getting at. If you really watch chickens a lot in a orchards, they're always around the base of the tree a lot of times, and that's because you have the larvae is up in the tree. It comes down into down the bark. It's down in the mulch and the leaf litter. and it's in the fruit, or nut, any kind of leftover fruit or nut and things, you get, certain types of insects, worms and larvae. And, for instance, say in apples, we know that chickens can play a really big role in reducing codling moth pressure, and especially if you run them at the right time if the degree days, you look at that when you have emergence of this larvae from the soil to become, metamorph into an adult, a moth. But yeah, they're going to get at that larvae and they're going to reduce the population. Are they going to do it 100%? No, but it's one tool in the toolbox. And it's the same thing with the navel orangeworm or other moth species. And this applies too in vegetable systems. If you can run chickens through, if you're growing cabbage where moths are a real big problem, it would be great to run chickens, through those fields after harvest. And then the other thing is, if people aren't familiar with commercial orcharding, there's a lot of money spent in sanitation practices. And what that means is cleaning up the material, usually the leaf material, the mulch, the fallen and fruit, nut. They come through with equipment and they're going to blow or sweep out the material from the berm so that you don't have any inoculant, quote unquote, we'll say, disease inoculating or insects overwintering. And then that gets pushed into the tractor avenues, into the middles, and they get shredded down. And often they apply, quite a bit of urea or some kind of nitrogen source to burn that material down. Now, you bring in livestock, you say sheep come in, they're going to be eating any fallen fruit. They're going to eat nuts. All of their urine and manure is adding and helping with that decomposition. The biology from their saliva and their gut is enhancing the decomposition of this leaf litter. And the same thing with chickens and if we have cattle. So they're really playing a huge role in that turnover, that decomposition. They're going to help build that biology that's going to break down and suppress some of these disease pathogens. Because it is true, apple scab, pecan scab, alternaria, things like that, they do inoculate on the leaves, but that's because the whole system is, out of balance. So the livestock can really help as a super strong tool to start shifting. And that's where the real regenerative work comes in. But as we know, bringing livestock into orchards is much easier said than done. So there's a huge topic there to get into.
Yeah. Can you give me some examples of ways that you've seen it done well?
Yeah, I've seen it done well. Sheep are quite popular, especially out west. They're working really well in any orchard system, but almonds we're seeing a lot in, nut crops. If people can run their own herd, usually that's, where you have the true advantage, because it's, bringing in contract grazing. There's a whole relationship to figure out with the grazer and how you're going to, do it adaptively, do it regeneratively in a way that we're not overgrazing. We know, cattle work really well in pecans or bigger trees, wider space trees. They would work well in walnuts and pistachios. I've seen good examples of people doing it there. And, it's the cattle are really compatible with these large trees, and it's nice because you get to put out one polywire versus sheep. You normally need two. Some people really feel they need three, and it depends where you are located. I mean, when you're close to a main road, it could be very difficult to commit to sheep because a lot of orchards aren't complete. They're not fenced off.
Right.
So these are things that, we look at. And then chickens are great because they're low cost to get into. They're very, the commitment to them doesn't feel as overwhelming. It's easy, if you want to manage meat birds because you don't want to deal with animals year round, you got 90, 120 days and, you're going to have some kind of good animal impact out there. And, but chickens work really well in stone fruit. I mean, basically anything. I've seen them in quite a few orchards, and Usually the smaller, I haven't really come across a large scale orchard operation yet. And I mean large, meaning over 1,000 acres that's really committed to livestock being integrated, but it's usually the smaller growers, anywhere from a few acres up to, I've seen some of the better, systems I've seen where people have about 800 to 1,000 acres are able to run, sizable sheep katahdin and sell meat and run, sizable layers through them. I also would like to mention we have a Soil Health Academy coming up April 1st through the 3rd at the Burroughs Family Farm on an almond walnut orchard, and they run various livestock, including katahdin, sheep and chickens, and they have some pigs and things like that. And so if people aren't familiar, the Soil Health Academy is the nonprofit arm, we usually say, of Understanding Ag. And that will be the first academy of the season, again, April 1st through the 3rd. And I should note that we do have some scholarships available for orchardists, in particular nut growers. And that has been sponsored by Simple Mills, who is sponsorship of this academy. So a lot of good opportunity for this one.
Can you talk a little bit about maybe your ideal, your ideal for a regeneratively managed orchard? Some of these, integrating all of these things that we've kind of talked about, the livestock integration, all of the other strategies we've mentioned here. Just kind of walk me through that, maybe even on what kind of trees, where is it, east, in the west or in the east, and just talk to me about some of those things.
That's a heavy question. I would certainly favor a western climate because we have less disease pressure here and we can control moisture. You could get away with no irrigation out east. So there's something to be said when we start trying to weigh out what's more regenerative than the other in terms of our resources. But I guess, if I'm a West Coast person, I do work across the country, but a lot of crops are much easier to farm regeneratively and organically. If we want to throw organic into the equation, because, now we open up a different toolbox of biofungicides and, things that are certified organic. Not that I'm talking about growing for organic sale, but just the products that are available, that there's a lot of good bioinsecticide and biofungicides that you can have at your tool belt that's not going to completely disrupt the ecosystem. I would like to see, a diversity of crops. And if I'm in California, you can grow so many different orchard crops. So if it was an ideal regenerative system, I would have some stone fruit, some peaches and nectarines. I'd probably throw a plum in there. I would certainly have apples, and I would focus on processing apples and probably cider apples and not be too concerned about the fresh market, just because codlin moth is just so difficult. That's, we could talk about apples and in terms of their challenges, because the fresh market is what really reduces the true ability to farm it very regeneratively. Because, I'd probably maybe have some nut crops, but if I did, I'm not sure, because of the harvest requirement. A lot of nuts got to be dropped to the ground. It reduces your ability to manage for regenerative ground cover. I'd probably take nut crops out of the equation, and I would want more smaller market, direct market that I could be looking at and value added. So maybe some elderberry. We can do some syrups. They're medicinal. I'd probably like to fit in some kind of integration of culinary and medicinal herbs. I don't know exactly what those might be, but there's even things like California ginseng, and looking at how can we grow things that we can dry and they can go into tea products or, other food products. I'd certainly probably have grapes. I really love grapes, and I would be very interested in more regenerative table grapes. If you get It's like anything else. If you get a really, you harvest a fresh bunch of grape, which I've had the pleasure to do, off of grapes grown around the house. I mean, it is like, wow, how tasty. Now, in the standard table grapes in the conventional world, they're harvested very early. They go into long periods of storage. It's really this like poppy, crunchy water in your mouth. And, you get lucky if you get real flavor out of a grape. So I would certainly throw grapes in the equation. And, the livestock, I would probably be looking at sheep and chickens, and I would focus on chickens, maybe even look at turkeys, running some turkeys through Thanksgiving. That's become really popular. So maybe, a livestock that I don't have to commit to 365 days a year, but to be able to stack, enterprise. And, people ask a lot about, well, would you grow vegetables in the alleyways and create this whole multi-story farming? And, I have worked with that and have had an opportunity to do that kind of farming. And I'll tell you that I've kind of come to the point where I don't believe that you can manage the most regenerative system when you integrate annuals into the orchard, because I can reduce my labor out there and reduce the disturbance to the soil and just focus on growing good forage for livestock, And if I want to grow vegetables, I'd rather do it off on another plot where I can more opportunity on the proper rotations and proper cover crop management. I know that wasn't really a question you asked, but I would be integrating some sort of annual crop. I wouldn't want to be fully focused on vegetables because of how labor intensive they are, but I would certainly want to find ways to integrate some storage crops and some low maintenance vegetable crops, things like butternut, garlic, and, maybe one high value crop somewhere in the rotation.
Sure. In your mind, is there one of the 6 principles that shines in orchards?
Well, it should be maintaining a living root.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really no need to be tilling in an orchard at all. So I'd have to say that even if you're terminating weeds around the base of the tree and everything, you've got a tree that's got a root system in the ground. So that better be it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Is there one that is most challenging in your experience? Is there one of the 6 principles that's most challenging in the orchard context?
Definitely integrating livestock.
Yeah.
Because a lot of orchardists and specialty crop growers, they're not used to dealing with their cash crop 365 days a year. You get a big break. Once harvest is over, you get to kick back. It's very common in orchard industries for people to have a winter hobby, hunting, skiing. Not as much in livestock. People are, have to be with their animals 365 days a year, and depending on the operation. And then, is the property set up for it, the infrastructure? And if you're going to commit to your own livestock, you've got to now get into those markets.
Yeah. And
sometimes that might even require to allocate an employee or bring in another employee, and then I would say the other reason integrating livestock is difficult. Well, there's 2 big reasons we should just bring up real quick. I mentioned it earlier, contract grazing, to find that right relationship. It's possible. I don't want to put, there shouldn't be a big barrier on that. If you really want to do it, you'll find the right people. But then there's the food safety regulations that restrict grazing 90 or 120 days before harvest. And so then you have to make, if you're going to commit to your own herd in particular, your own livestock, you've got to design your land and your property to be able to hold those animals during that 90 to 100 day period. And, you don't want to be getting caught. I mean, I've seen a lot of people bring livestock in and get really pumped about it. And guess what? In orchards, their feed costs are way too high.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is you've got to make sure your orchards are set up to have good forage before you start bringing them in there, or you're just immediately going to be dealing with feed and other, supplement mineral costs and things that, we teach people to get away from.
Maybe there's an opportunity for like a venture capital pitch here where you say, "Hey, I'm gonna be the guy who brings the livestock to the orchardist, And then, we're going to have multiple orchards under contract, and we're going to hit this one at this time because that's the time of year they're growing that crop, and we're going to go to that one at this time, and maybe just have that whole thing, some venture capital money pumped into it so that it can scale and be more of like a service, like an Uber for grazing on these orchards. It's almost got to be something that's tailored. I'm focused on you and your orchard and grazing at the right time for you, rather than trying to say, I'm going to try and fit this into my existing livestock operation.
Yeah, I can envision, I've talked about this a lot with people. There is just wide open opportunity with something like that, where you have regenerative contract grazers, and these types of outfits could move the needle so much faster and be really responsible for moving that needle, because you could imagine they're going to be connecting with passionate regenerative folks, but you're going to have neighbors nearby that are, what if farmers at the end of the day say, well, you show me the money? And so if a contract grazer is like, hey, listen, I know you don't know a whole lot about regenerative, but here's the deal. If you grow more vegetation out there, and I'm going to be across the street anyways, then I would be enticed to come over here, and I'll pay you a little bit of money per acre, or, they can, figure that out. And they could really sell a farmer into the benefits of bringing livestock in, and the farmer wouldn't even have to really worry about it. It'd be a pleasure for them to see animals in their orchard and know that they don't really have to do much. Oh man, it's a really, I met a few people who are doing it, but I haven't met anyone I yet have met a contract grazer though, who's doing it really well, where they're not overgrazing. And one of the things that I see right now is, and I'm in conversations with a few folks in California about this, is a lot of contract grazers will still have this mindset of, well, if I'm doing the work over there, like we see it in vineyards, they bring sheep in and they want to graze everything down. And there's this idea that just integrating the animal is, boom, leading to better soil health. And I'm actually seeing the opposite. And we're also finding out that a lot of these contract grazers and I'm not saying all of them, but some of them are capitalizing on this, the idea that livestock brings such tremendous value that they're charging the grower, I've heard upwards to $150 per acre to bring sheep into a vineyard. So we have some things to figure out here, but if there's anyone listening to this who's passionate and has orchards around them, I promise you, I'm pretty sure you could start up a pretty good business pretty quickly and really help.
Yeah. And then from the orchard's perspective, if you've kind of got some of those things figured out so that it's not going to be a burden to the business, especially if you're already direct marketing some of that produce to a restaurant, now you've already got their relationship. Say, hey, we're also going to be offering grass-fed or grass-finished lamb, or we're going to be offering, pastured poultry. Some of those are already kind of natural relationships where you could go to them and say, hey, we've got this protein source too. Would you be interested in that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think that's something to think about. I would like you to tell me your favorite story of change from a regenerative perspective as it regards orcharding. Some of those that jump to the front of your mind.
Maybe some of them aren't necessarily farms I've actually been on, or worked with. When you said that, I recently had the opportunity to meet Troy Swift with Swift Pecans, and him and I are going to be speaking together next week and running a regenerative workshop in California. And I know his story and his family, and, coming from a conventional pecan world and what he's been able to do right now. I have yet to been to his orchard, but I know he's really flipped the script, you could say, and he's managing for great diversity out there and biodiversity, and he's just really done things where it's like, I'm going to stop spraying and see what happens, and he sees those benefits, and then there are right now I mean, my own experience comes from, when I had gotten into as an ecological farmer, we called it in California, the eco farm, and was primarily vegetables and small orcharding. And then I ended up in vineyards. And when I got sucked into the vineyard industry, I was pulled into a pretty conventional world. And I mean, my experience was a slow progression, but really realizing everything we're talking about today, and that's my experience comes from seeing this happen. We have some clients right now who are really making some big moves. And so, I've got a pistachio grower that's starting to make some really big moves. And, I don't have the Cinderella or whatever you want to call the glorious end of the story ending yet, but, we see, I've seen quite a bit. I don't know. I can't think. The only one that just comes popping out in my mind, and funny, I just haven't even been there, is Troy Swift, because I love when I hear about people just saying, I'm going to stop spraying and I'm going to see what happens out there. And along my way, I'm meeting a lot of vineyard producers like that. We're finding that grapes are fairly easy in California when it comes to reducing the fungicide inputs. And sorry, I don't have one that's just popping off the top of my head.
You're good. Just Googling Troy Swift, you come up to his website, and one of the first things that pops up on his website is bat houses. So there's another way to deal with pests is bring in some bat houses and have them hunting critters for you at night.
Yeah, that's something that I probably recommend almost all of our clients. And I say, find the time to invest in bat boxes, bluebird boxes, put some raptor perches up. And, I've heard some crazy numbers about bats taking out hundreds to thousands of moths and flying insects in a given, evening.
Right.
So it is incredible what's possible. And, we have some clients that, I didn't mention in that last segment, but who have really improved the ecosystem, and the bird populations are incredible. I just captured a video that maybe I'll put together and put out on YouTube at some point, but it just an orchestra of birds in an almond orchard, and right next door is a conventional. And I went over there, and you couldn't hear any birds. It's just remarkable, what's possible.
Yep. Well, Chuck, anything else that really you feel like needs to be said with regard to this topic?
The last thing I'll say is I've always considered orchards, I mean, they're a perennial crop, to be so compatible with regenerative work. Before we called it regenerative farming, ecological farming, biological farming, I always have looked at perennial systems to be the ideal, whether it's a perennial pasture or, again, a perennial fruit crop, that they are the most ideal systems for regenerative farming. And why? We don't have to turn the soil over, and we can really manage for an ecosystem. So I would just say last thing is, we talk about mimicking nature. We need to start looking at orchards, whether it be raspberries, blueberries, vineyards, fruit trees. Look at them more as a woodland ecosystem. And how do you start promoting those types of, characteristics that a woodland or grass, woodland savanna type ecosystem might have.
Yeah. Very good. Chuck, thanks for your time today.
All right. Thanks, Clay.
Very good stuff with Chuck. Really appreciate him helping me wrap my mind around kind of the context that exists currently in orchard management and some of the ways forward in regenerating that system. Up next on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking also with another Understanding Ag consultant, Brian Doherty, for a Friday episode, and we're going to talk to him about regenerative nutrient management. How do we take care of the nutrients on the landscape and make sure that they go in the right place and that they stay where we want them and that they do what they were designed to do. So we'll see you again real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.